Good morning. I think that we are in the month of Adar Rishon, which of course tells us that this is a Shana Muberes, called a leap year, but interesting term in the Chazal, Muberes, as in pregnant month, or pregnant year, we should say, which I'll talk about. So I thought appropriate, since everything Chassidus comes to introduce the neshama and the primus of a subject matter, that would be good to focus on what is the Chassidic perspective, so to speak, on Shana Muberes, and specifically the 2 months of Adar. And being that I see that different places it's discussed, so it'd be good to gather together from different marmikemis, which I'll point out. That's what I'd like to talk about, the Chassidic approach. And obviously everything comes down to Hirah in Avedis Hashem, lessons in our lives from a special year like the Shana Muberes. It's interesting that among many different things that the Rebbe emphasized, Shana Muberes was always, whenever it was a special year by the Rebbe, always talked about it throughout the year. You don't really find it so much by the other Rabbeim, more beremes, here and there, but by the Rebbe, which just I want to say a few words about that. Always found it very fascinating that when you look at the Rebbe's emphasis and so-called niftzoyim, so you don't see much of the Rebbe's emphasis, let's say, on spreading the idea of Yom Kippur, or Pesach even. Yeah, the idea of Mivtza Matzah was the Rebbe's first campaign, but not, when it comes, for example, to the 3 weeks, it's a whole shturim. 3 weeks, the 9 days, comes to days like Zayin Cheshvan, or Chamisha B'Av, days that you usually don't really even hear about. If we didn't hear in the Sichos, it would be, if you know the Maimoreh Chazal, you know about these days. They don't necessarily play prominent role so much in Jewish culture and Jewish life. Or another example, Simchas Beis HaSheva. So yes, Simchas Beis HaSheva is known, the concept, but the Rebbe made it into a whole shturim. And many other such examples. So the obvious answer, though I never heard it straight from the Rebbe, would be that the things that are already prominent in the Jewish minds and Jewish consciousness, let's say Yom Kippur, is the day when almost all the Yidden, some way or another, the shuls are full, and so on. Not that it's not a holy day, it's obviously Achaz B'Shana is the holiest day in the year, and the Rebbe spoke about it, the Maimorim speak about it. But as a campaign, the Rebbe focused on things that were more like Mechadesh HaYeshenis, like things like Divrei Kfushin, for example. In Tavshil Lamed Ches, the Rebbe was Mechader Divrei Kfushin, Asar B'Teves that year. The Rebbe said, it's a minig to speak Divrei Kfushin, which is Divrei Seiridus, in a Yom Tonis. And the Rebbe took a tainis and turned the Eis Rotzen, Yom Rotzen Lashem. So the things that were less known and became more, like a Zecher from the olden days, the Rebbe turned it into a whole active movement. And especially the negative things, like the 3 weeks, or I just mentioned Divrei Kfushin, the Yom Tonis, the idea of being mahapach and transforming things that on the surface seem to be like a negative day. So again, Chassidus talks about, obviously, the Yahov Yom Meil L'Sason L'Simcha L'Meid in Tevim is not a chiddush of the Rebbe. It's a pasuk in Schari and in different nevuos. The Rambam brings it. But to make it a active, living entity that has become now like Shagar B'Fi Keil, that people talk about it and people live with it, that was so one of the chidushim of the Rebbe was that. And the other Rabbeim, they had different functions. The Rebbe's main challenge was, of course, assimilation and trying to reawaken the Lev Yisrael, that even when Libi Eid is Ani Yishena V'Libi Eid, that even when there's Yishena of Golus, there should be a Libi Eid. So it makes sense that the Rebbe would do that. So that's a few words on that. So Shana Muberes goes into that category as well. It's a thing that, yes, in halacha, it's in the Geir, there's all kinds of halachas in a year like this, in Adarishin, Adasheni, and if a person has a bar mitzvah, and they were born in Adarishin, when do they celebrate it? It's all the different dinim and the different nafkaminas in halacha. And of course, Mismagul Lagula, when it's put in, etc., etc. But to turn it into a whole Avedis Hashem, Aderech and Aveda, that was something you find in many, many sikhs of the Rebbe. I'm going to try to sum up some of the main points. So, in a sense, is it a chiddush of the Rebbe? It's a chiddush, like Kol Masha Talmud Vasagos L'Chadash Nit L'Meish Messinei. Even a chiddush was there before, but it's like being mechadish, as the Rebbe explains, Pirush HaBal Shem Tov, and that this Fanandi Gespreit. The word of Lo'elam Hashem Dvorchen Yitzur B'Shamayim existed. It says in the Medrash, the idea of perpetual machadish betuva b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh bereishis. But the Baal Shem Tov turned it into a pirush. He spread it. He turned it into a doctrine that became a yesod in Teres Chassidus and Teres in general. So that sort of introduction. Let's talk about Hashanah Muberes. So what do we know? We know, of course, the halachas about it. Why is there Hashanah Muberes in the first place? So the answer is because of some psukim that need to be reconciled. The calendar, the luach, the Jewish calendar goes by the moon, the lunar calendar. Everything begins with Kiddush Alavona, Chedesh Hazel Lechem. So when the Eidos in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and today it's through the Cheshbon of Hillel, when they see the new moon, they declare, the Bezdin declares it's Achresh Chedesh, and B'meila everything follows there. 2 weeks after the Chedesh is Betzmei Yom Hazeh, is Pesach, the 15th, the full moon of Nisan. Rosh Hashanah is on the new moon. Sukkot is the full moon of Tishrei. Everything is around the lunar calendar. Okay, all good. Then comes the pasuk that says Chedesh HaAviv, that Pesach should be in the spring. We know the seasons are not determined by the moon; they're determined by the sun, by the cycle of the sun. The 4 seasons. Since it has to be in spring, if you would just follow the lunar calendar, so the lunar calendar we know is 11 and some hours, 11 and a half days, let's say, roughly shorter than the 365-day solar year. So it's a 354 and some is a lunar year. So the problem would be, the first year, fine, it would be in the month of spring, the first Pesach. But the next year would be 11 days earlier, still spring, then 22 and 33, roughly again. At some point, it would end up being in the winter, Pesach. And if you keep going, it would end up being in the autumn, and then back into the summer, and then back to the spring. So in other words, the season would not be Chedesh HaAviv. So from that, from there, the Chazal learned that the Ma'abrim Hashanah, the Mitzvah Sibur, and they calculated in order to compensate for this deficit, that every 19 years in a Machzor Kotten, you make 7 Shnei Sa'ibur, 7 leap years, adding a month. A month is 30 days. 30 days is somewhat close to 3 years of deficit, because 11 days, so 11 would be 33. It's a little less than that. But that way, you keep the balance. So every 2-3 years would be a Shna Se'ibur, basically 7 times in 19 years. So a little less than 3 times every 3 years. And that way, that year will have an extra 30 days, would not just compensate, it would be more than just the 11-day deficit, and you're not ma'aber half months. That's what the Chazal say. So you have to add a full month. So therefore, you're always ahead of the game, so to speak. And then, as the deficit builds again, comes the next Shna Se'ibur, and it keeps the balance. And there's different days. Rav Ada and Shmuel, do you exactly compensate, or is there still some discrepancy? But the bottom line, Chedesh HaAviv is covered, because the month of spring is not one day. The month of spring is a season. So Pesach will always be in the spring in Eretz Yisrael, of course. There's Chassidus and halacha about, so what about in Australia and the Chutzi Kadra Tachn, where Pesach, the spring, by them is the autumn. It's another discussion, but that goes like the same thing with Kiddush Levana, that when Kiddush Levana, not by when the Levana is a new month by us, it's a new month in Eretz Yisrael. So as I said, I'm not going to go through the halachas of it. There's a lot of details and so on. But that's the gist of Shana Mu'beres. Now, Nigla and halacha is not going to ask the following question. Why did Eibush to make this in the first place that way? You want to have Chedesh Aviv, why didn't he just make the lunar year and the solar year as equal? Klotzkashin. I understand, once it's not the same size, you have to Shana Mu'beres, but what do you need all these kunsten for? So, of course, that takes us back to the reason why the moon is taka shorter, because of the Miyut HaLevana. On the fourth day of creation, the Eibush said, created the two great luminaries, Moira Kot, Moira Godel. Moira Kot, the sun and the moon. And why does it say Moira Kot if he says Shnei Meres Agdelim? So the Sugi in Chulin, that the Eibush was Mamayed the Yereya because the moon came with a complaint. Mekatrik, Kitrig Alavona, that a king can't have two crowns, and therefore, or two kings. There's different ways it's explained, but bottom line is you can't have two crowns, so you have to have one godly. You can't have two gedalim, basically. So they wish to say, if that's the case, you be mamayit yourself, you become smaller, moira kotten, so there'll be only one moira god. And then the strange continuation of the Gemara, the Eibishter then has charota, and says, and that's why on Rosh Chodesh, which indicates, Rosh Chodesh, of course, is the celebration of the new moon. That's why the Eibishter said, bring a korban chatas for me. Hevia like kapara, I want to atone, that I diminish the moon. Which itself, what does that mean exactly? The Eibush diminished, then he regretted it. If you regretted it, why don't you just give the moon back its full light? So what the whole Gemara needs explanation. So all this leads us into understanding a deeper sugya here, which in Kabbalah and Eitz Chaim and Chassidus talks about it. Just to give a few Marmikemis, there's a powerful Maimer, Mocher Chedesh Maimer, which from the Alter Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, builds upon it, the whole Maimer in Eira Teira Bereshis. So Maimer the Rebbe would chazer very many times from, especially Maimorim by Mocher Chedesh, Maimorim by Yemele Yenesen, the Mocher Chedesh Maimorim, which means Mocher Chedesh when Shabbos is Erev Chedesh. And then there is also, from Rabbi Isaac Homler, a whole sefer called Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim, where the whole theme of the book, of the sefer, is about the Miyat HaLevana, and that's why it's called Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim. And of course, in the Chassidus itself, in many Maimorim this is discussed. I'm taking a lot from these Maimorim, but also from how the Rebbe explains it, because the Rebbe, many Sichos and Maimorim discuss this whole topic. Now, to get into more detail, we know also that the Rabbeim, the expression from the Sichos of the Frierdiker Rebbe, I think I don't remember the exact lashon, but the Teichen was a merigahat for Shana Mu'beres. They get sitter sometimes, the expressions. They trembled. They were concerned when it came to a leap year. And there was many times leap years was not always boding well for Am Yisrael. Now, what's the reason for that? Why is a leap year? The answer is because of Miyut HaYereach. So we know the Gemara says when it comes to a lunar eclipse, so we know it says a Likui Levana is a siman, not a positive siman for Eden, because Yisrael Daimim the Levana and Meinin the Levana were compared to the moon, and we count by the moon, as I said. So when there's a Likui Levana, which means the Levana is eclipsed, it's not a positive sign because it just shows on a darkness, on a cover-up, a hester ponim, so to speak, of the Levana. The Miyut HaYereach is obviously even a bigger scale, because the Miyut HaYereach is a fundamental shift that happened, that the Levana became diminished. So Chitzeniusdik, a diminished moon, is not considered a positive thing. So the whole reason is the Shana Mu'beres is because Miyut HaLevana. So that's one of the explanations why the Rabbeim saw this doesn't mean Chas v'Shalom that takes away our Bechira, and it doesn't mean it's predestined that something bad, God forbid, is going to happen that year. But it's like anything, a predisposition, we call it. Just like there's certain dinim in the 9 days you don't do, not because 9 days says, God forbid, something bad's going to happen. But it's a time where we call it more of a helam. When there's a helam, you have to lay low. You don't do weddings. You don't go to dinteres. The different things that Allah tells us. Just like in this month of Ad, Mishenichnas Adar, Marbin B'Simcha. So this Mishanichnas of is Memayitin. So the point being is that the Shana Mu'beres was considered a time where they were more, call it more careful, if you wish. And indeed, things happen. I mean, I'm sure everybody is aware what happened. That they call today October 7th, right? The beginning of Tavshin Pei Dalet, Shana Mu'beres, Shmini Atzeres. Again, it doesn't mean it had to happen. It means that that it reminds us, the Miyat HaLavana, that the world is not yet in a perfect place. Let's put it that way. So how does Chassidus explain the Inyan of Miyat HaLavana, which will really help us understand what Shana Mu'beres is and why the Eibishter made it in the first place this way, and the Maila also of Shana Mu'beres. Because on one hand, yes, it reminds us of the diminishment of the moon, but in Torah we all know there's no such thing as just negative. Every negative is meant to bring a deeper positive. I mentioned before, Yahovchi Yom HaMeil L'Sosan L'Simcha. And that's another thing I think that the Rebbe emphasized. Why he wanted to emphasize, to show that even though it has a certain element of negative energy, but the Rebbe was mahapachit by explaining that Shana Mu'beres, you have an extra Adar, and it's not just another month, it's a month of Simcha, and which, of course, the month of Adar is a Napachu. That's why it's Simcha. It's again a Hisapcha from the darkness. So we'll talk all about that shortly. So what does Chassidus explain? What is this whole Miyat HaYereach? And how does it play a role in the whole picture? And above all, as I said, always negei lepeil to us in our lives, my benaihu. So there's a powerful maimer that I'm sure you've learned, Imruach HaMeshel, or Al-Ken Yemru HaMeshel. I think it's in Tov Reish Tzadik Hey from the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's a maimer that's brought quite a few places. It's a Bolok maimer where he talks about that, especially in the Maimer Bos Legani Tovshin Lamed Aleph, the Rebbe quotes from it a lot. He talks about how the Eibishter created existence. And we all know it all began with the Tzimtzum Arishin. That in order for existence to be, for an independent consciousness to emerge, so Lifnei Ad Tzimtzum in the Lashon of Eitz Chaim it was Ein Sof was Mamala Kol HaMetzias, and Lo Hayeh Nesinas Mokem Le'elam Esklal. So it's like a brilliant teacher who's so powerful and infinite in his wisdom, there's no room for anyone in his space. So the Eibishter created at Tzimtzum Arishin, the Lashon of the Arizal, Tzimtzum Eirei, and basically contracted or concealed the Eir to allow for Chol L'Mokem Ponei, space. And the Moshel Alter Rebbe gives, the Moshel of the Rav and Talmud, that the teacher has to quiet himself down, so-called slow down or conceal most of his brilliant wisdom in order to be able to teach Aleph Beis to a student. And if he didn't do that, the student would be overwhelmed and wouldn't find any space for himself. And then comes Amshach of the Kav, which is a Kav Dak v'Kotzer, a Kav V'Chut, like I think of it like a laser beam, like a paintbrush that Eibishter uses like an artist to create all of existence. And now we have Eir Ein Sof in a world that can contain that Eir. And our Aveda is to retrace the steps and bring more and more Eir into the Chol HaMokem Ponei, which is this world. I mean, obviously I should mention the whole Seder Shtalshelus, as the Alter Rebbe explains, all the way to Elam Hazeh Tachten, She'en Tachten L'matim Mimenu. Tachten is not in Mokim, but in Gili and Helam. So it's the ultimate Helam. And in this world, in Tachtenim, we should be Megala Alakus through Torah and Mitzvahs. And that in turn brings more and more Eir from the Kav into our lives. Eir is B'Kelim. And as the Kelim expand, more Eir. And you could retrace the steps all the way back to the Reishis HaKav and all the way to Lifnei Ad Tzimtzum. Which this talks about that we can access Lifnei Ad Tzimtzum, La'achrei Ad Tzimtzum. In the beginning of Samach Vav, talks about it, Barichas. Ahim Beis is based on this. All the Chassidus of Chassidus is based on this concept. Okay. So you have the Tzimtzum Arishin, but the Tzimtzum Arishin is only the first step. Then we know that the Tzimtzum, as he explains in this Maimer, the Tzimtzum continues, and as a result of the Tzimtzum came also the imbalance of what we call the world of Tayu, of Shviras HaKelim. Shviras HaKelim is only possible when there's two entities. Lifnei Ad Tzimtzum, there can't be Shviras HaKelim, obviously, because first of all, there's no Kelim altogether. And it's just Eir Ein Sof, Mamala Kol HaMetzias, there's no room for any conflict or tension, so to speak. But La'achrei Ad Tzimtzum, there's the tension between the Eir and the Keli, the Eiris and the Kelim, Eres merubim, kelim otim, it creates shviras hakelim. So there you have the second, so to speak, I don't want to use the word dysfunctionality, but the second dissonance and tension between two realities. The tzimtzum is the first, because the tzimtzum conceals Eid Ein Sof. So it's true, the Eid Ein Sof, from Eid Ein Sof's point of view, there's no shinui at all. It's only mitzad the Mekablim, but the Mekablim can misunderstand the tzimtzum, and the Shviras HaKelim takes it to the next step. Then, in this process, says the Alter Friedrich Rebbe, the next step would be Miyat HaLavana. The Miyat HaLavana, which happened in the fourth day of creation, is a result of the Shviras HaKelim, which is a result of the Tzimtzum HaRishon. So in other words, had the Eibishter never concealed himself, in the first place, or concealed Eid Ein Sof, I should say, but never have had any situation like this. Miyat HaLavana is essentially a similar idea like Tzimtzum, a diminishment. So when the Levana came and complained, Levana had a taina. Levana wasn't an ego trip that the Levana says, I want to be the king, and not the Shemesh. The Levana was basically saying, you can't have two leaders. It's like you can't have two kings over one empire. And so the Eibishter said, okay, so you be Mamai yourself. So what's really the Teichna Dvarim? The Levana represents Malchus. The Shemesh represents Zoh. Mashpia Mekabel. Zoch is the Keva and Zocher. Now, Malchus, we know, less Lama Gamo Klum, and that's only a result because of the Helam of the Tzimtzum. Again, Lifnei Tzimtzum, you don't say less Lama Gamo Klum on anything, because there's Eid Ein Sof everywhere. Where Shaykh less Lama Gamo Klum, which means it has nothing of its own, is only in a world where there are levels. So there's a level of Gilui and there's a level of Helam. So basically, briefly, in simple English, Malchus represents Helam, and Shemesh represents Gilui. And both are necessary. So the Miyat HaLavana, even though we call it a type of punishment, so to speak, but it's not really a punishment, because in Teda everything is Siba Mesuba, of cause and effect. It's a part of the process that the fact is that once you have a tzimtzum, you're going to have a mashpia makabel, because the whole point of the tzimtzum is that there should be a makabel. And the makabel is not going to be on the same level as the mashpia, initially. So the Levana represents the makabel, the Eira makabel, that receives from the Shemesh, and the Shemesh represents the Eira Mashpia. So in essence, is it a negative thing or is it a positive thing? It's the same question you could ask about the Tzimtzum. Is the Tzimtzum a good thing or a bad thing? If it's a good thing, because without it we wouldn't exist. It's a negative thing because without the Helam wouldn't be all the Golas and all the Tzaras we have. So that's why Chassidus uses the expression from that Maimer, from the Friedrich Rebbe, and other Maimarim, that Tzimtzum is B'shvil Hagilui. The point is not that Tzimtzum is a B'shvil Atzmei. It's never meant to be a conceal. When a teacher conceals his seichel in order to teach a student, it's not a Helam La'atzmei. It's a concealment in order there should be a Gili. Because if you say everything, you try to teach children Aleph Beis, and you say everything you know, the children will be overwhelmed. So you have to conceal in order to reveal. So that's the Nekuda. So it's really a positive thing, but only when you know it's an Emtsai for another Matara. That's why there's actually a Lashon Chassidus, a few places that says, Tzimtzum is Heipach HaRatzon. That's what it says, Heipach HaRatzon. Heipach HaRatzon, what do you mean? Who created the Tzimtzum? Isn't the Eibishter the one that created the Tzimtzum? Didn't he want it? Of course he wanted the Tzimtzum. What means Heipach HaRatzon? Who else is there besides God there? It's not, if you say an Aveda is Heipach HaRatzon, fine. You're Eiver Ad-Ritzein Shel Kodesh Baruch Hu. But who created the Tzimtzum? It wasn't like there was another force, God forbid. So the Gvar Chassidus says, like the Rebbe Rashab explains in Teira Shalom, Heipach HaRatzon means that the Ratzon should be Heipach HaRatzon. The Eibishter wanted things that I want Gilui. But in order to have Gilui, I create Helam. So the Helam Etzla Atzmei is Heipach HaRatzon, because it's B'shvil HaGilui. So Derech we say in Chazal, it says that there are three things, or in the Yerushalmi it says four things. The Eibishter is Mischaret B'chol Yem. He regrets every day. What does that mean? So why did you create it? One of them is the Yetzer Hara. If you regretted it, why did you create it in the first place? The answer is he created it and says, I created something because I don't want it for itself. The Yetzer Hara is only meant to be like the Moshel Hazena in Tanya. It's only meant to be to bring out the keiches of the Ben HaMelech. It's not an end in itself. So I regret the very mitzias of it la'atzmei, but I don't regret what it's meant to bring. So the same idea with the Miyat HaLavana, when the Eibishter says, Hevi alai kapara, why isn't he then corrected? Because he's saying, the very fact that I created a tzimtzum, the very fact that I created a helam, and then a mirat halavona is not something I want as an end in itself. That is something that needs a kapara. I want the gili that will come from it. That will in turn evoke and provoke the Aveda that will be mamala the chesodin of mirat halavona. So that is how briefly Chassidus explains the whole concept. Now one more thing, mirat halavona, the next step in the process is chet eitz hadas. So it's really like, if you think of it like a shtalshlus, it's like simtsum, shviras hakelim, mirat halavona, chet eitz hadas. The chet eitz hadas could never have happened if you didn't have the first three steps, because how could Adam Machava, who created B'Tselem Elikim, Yitzir Kapur Shal Kodesh Baruch, how could they ever transgress? Only because there's a helam. If there was no helam, they couldn't. If they were living at Tzimtzum, I mean, if it was possible, hypothetically, there's no room for B'chal B'chira. So in other words, the whole concept as Aretza Lites Yita that the Gemara says, the Eibishter says to Moshe, by Nasa Odam, those that want to make a mistake shall make a mistake. Also, strange Gemara. Moshe is learning Torah with the Eibishter. They come to the pasuk Nasa Odam, B'tzamenu Kid Musenu. Let us, Nasa is Lashon Rabin. Nasa, let us create a human being in our image. So Moshe right away, of course, he jumped and said, what does that mean? Who's us? Was it a shituf here? It's only Hashem Echad. People misunderstand, what do you mean by us? So there's the Meforshim, the Malachim, the Eibishter was Nimlach, but the Malachim or the Neshamis, whatever it may be. But why create a room for a mistake? So the Eibishter answers, the Gemara says, those that make a mistake will make a mistake. So the obvious question is, why does the Eibishter have to plant into the Torah a word that people can misunderstand as if there's like a shituf l'mayla, chaz v'shalom? Nasa. So the answer again is the same answer. The Eibishter is saying, I'm leaving room for b'chira. I create a world where it's possible for there to be atheism, agnosticism, because I concealed my presence. There was a famous Jewish, actually, his name was Christopher Hitchens, a Jew. He was a famous self-proclaimed atheist. He called radical atheist. He passed away a few years ago. And later they found out his mother's Jewish. You know, only good Jews can be good atheists like that. So they asked him before he had, unfortunately, he got Yena Machla, and he died like young. Before he passed away, they asked him what happens. You know, he was so anti-God. He wrote a book, God is Not Great. That was his big classic book. I'm not encouraging you to read it. I'm just telling you the facts. So they asked him, what happens if once you pass away, you find out there is a God? What are you going to say? He says, I'm going to ask God, why did he conceal himself so well? That's what he said. Why did he conceal himself so well? And it's interesting, Chassidus Hergish coming from someone who calls himself a kafir. But that's the truth. It would not be shaykh, the concept that someone can deny God's existence and say, Liya Eriv Aniyas Sini, or B'chlal, whatever. How's that possible? If Eineid Mulvade, Amalei Kol Aretz Kvede, and Yas Shamayim V'Saretz Animole, and Les Asar Ponim, and all the list. How is it possible that someone could right now be kafir? And the fact is, we don't need to be an atheist. All of us, like he says in Tanya. The mere fact that you can believe completely in the Eibishter and the same second later you can do an Aveda. How's it possible? That's why we say, Taka Eino Dem Ever Aveda, Elim Kenichnus by Ruach Shtus. Why Ruach Shtus? I remember someone asked me, what's a Ruach Shtus? I happen to have a good Yetzer Hara, and it's not a Ruach Shtus. It's not so crazy. Because the mere fact that a person can defy God, even if you believe and completely believe, it means there's a blindness, a moment of blindness. You're not seeing, you're not feeling. That's why it's possible that you could be mamash amayim. We're not talking about a hypocrite or a liar. Mamash amayim, but gam v'apul machtarta rachmana karya, because amunah is makif. So even as a gan, if he davens to Hashem to succeed in lei signev, in being aver on lei signev. So all this is what the Eibishter planted into the world. And many of the sikhs of the Rebbe, when the Rebbe cries to Hashem, he should end Golas and Bif Azashir and Ad Mosai, you know, all the very powerful sikhs. Essentially, if you hear the teichen of the sikhs, that's what the Rebbe is saying to the Eibishter. You know, Bif Azashir. I understand you made a tzimtzum and you made a helam, and it's all in order to bring Yerid Tzerech Aliyah and helam b'shul Agilui and all good zachen. But at some point, it's hepacharotz, and it's not what you want. You don't want the helam. Famous Sikh Eshain Rabba Mem Dalet, what the Rebbe is saying. And then the Rebbe, among tears, amidst tears, he says, the only way you can explain it is maybe while the Eibishter will mizal shnaim mitanemes. And if there'd be one speck of gilui, some explanation in Golus, we wouldn't cry with anemes because we'd have an explanation. So in other words, the Helam itself creates a situation where you cry out. The point being is that the Helam is necessary, but it's not the Kavanah. So Kavanah is the gilui, but the Helam is a step toward it. And that's how we understand Miyat HaYareach in context of Tzimtzum Arishin, same thing, Shviras HaKelim. You know, the guy in the Klotz Kasha, what is it? The Eibishter created a world of Tayu, and he didn't know that the Eiris are too strong for the Kelim that is going to shatter. Why didn't he create a balanced? Mela, we are human beings, we don't know. So you build something, and then you realize you didn't build it the proper way, so it breaks. But the Eibishter knows exactly what he's doing. The answer is the same answer again. He made it that way, because there is a tension between Gili and Helam, there's a tension between Eid and Keli, there's a tension between the Kavonas HaBriya and the Briya itself, and it's our job is to relieve that tension by realigning the two. So in that context, Miyat HaLevona, which is of course the whole yesod of why there is a Shana Muberes, which we'll get to now, is really essentially captures the essence of what the whole Kavonas HaBriya is. Part of it is the Shebiyah Helam, and where's the Helam in Malchus, which is Levona? And Levona goes through its cycles, so it waxes and wanes. We know, there's a new moon, then the new moon becomes a quarter, first quarter, then comes Kaima Siriba Shlamusa, a full moon, the third quarter, and then it starts and it's diminishing until it almost disappears, but then it's reborn again. And that's the key. The Helam HaLevona is to bring the Heim HaSidin L'Schadish Kamesa, the Chidush HaLevona. That's what the first mitzvah, the Eibishter says to Moshe, Chidush Hazeh Lachem. Chidush Hazeh Lachem. Chidush from the word Chidush. And that's the month would be the Geula. Why not in another month? This is a month, why Dafka in a month? Because that's what the Levana is, the goal of the Levana is not Helam, is Gili. I didn't wear Mitzrayim for 210 years and suffering, that's all B'shvil the Gili, a greater Gili. Achri Ken Yetzer B'Rechush Gadol. The Rechush Gadol that comes after the whole Helam and Yeridus. So Chidush Hazeh Lachem, that's the word, the Chidush Hadover. And that's Taka why La'osad Loveh. This was explained in a number of my Maimorim and Ayin Beis and Chelik Gimel, the Chelik Shnei Nemar, and in Sefer Shnei Ma'aris Agdelim from Rabbi Isaac Homler I mentioned, talks about that's why La'osad Loveh, we say, what will be La'osad Loveh? The moon will go back to its original size. It'll be Shnei Ma'aris Agdelim again. As a matter of fact, in Eitz Chaim, he talks about 7 levels of how you mamala the pagam of the Miyat HaLevona. And Navedis Hashem, throughout history, there were different times. The Man Shlema, for example, was Kaima Seder Bashlamusa throughout, and other Tkufis. So essentially, I'm not going to go through all the 7 levels, but essentially it's 7 levels in how you're miyachid, Zah and Malchus. So Malchus is Levona, Zah is the Shemesh. Shemesh and Levona are now Moira Godla, Moira Kotten, but the moon doesn't remain always the same size. There's, as I said, the new moon, there's the full moon, and also in history, different times in history reflected when by the Eden was a more Giluyim, so it was like a higher level of Malchus, Aliyas HaMalchus. So basically, briefly, it's Aliyas HaMalchus to the point that it becomes equal to Zah. That's when the sun and the moon will be equal, but then it says that Levana, Eira Levana will be, it says, Haya Eira Levana Ke'era Shemesh, but then Chassidus brings that the Levana will be even stronger than the Eira Shemesh, because the Makabel will be Mashpia to the Mashpia. Famous klal of Eishes Chayla Teres Baila, the Kevet to Save of Gover, that Malchus will be Mashpia into the Shemesh, which of course is a tremendous Chiddush, but it makes total sense, because that's the whole purpose what the Tzimtzum was about. The Eibishter created Dira B'Tachtenim, that Tachtenim are going to be Maile even the Elyenim. Today Tachtenim is lower than Atzilus, but L'Asad Love, when all the Gilui of all our Aveda today will be revealed, what will happen? It'll be that the Guf itself will be what says the Neshama Nizunis Min HaGuf. The Neshama will be fed and nourished by the body. That Tachtenim L'Atzmusei Yisbarach will be higher and elevate all the Elam Yenim. So now this Levana that went through all this miyut and all the challenges, actually becomes ultimately Yesh HaNivra, Yesh HaMiti, the Rebbe's words, brought from Chassidus, that Yesh HaNivra becomes even higher than the highest levels of Oyer. So the Levana will capture that, because ultimately the Kavana of the Levana, like the Kavana of the Yesh, was not to be Helam, it was to be Megala, the Etzem of Elikus, not just the Giluyim of Elikus. So in that sense, if you think of it that way, so Miyat HaLevana, on one hand, yes, ostensibly on the surface, it's a negative thing. But if you think of it the big picture, it actually brings something far greater than if there was no Miyat HaLevana. But you have that. But that's the kavanah. That's like saying we say Yofa Sha'achas but Shuva Ma'asim Tevim but Elam Hazim but Kol Chai Elam Abba. Golus achieves something more than Geula. That doesn't mean we don't want the Geula, because the Geula is the Gili of what the deeper kavanah of Golus is. So with that, let's go back to Shana Muberes now. But based on that, then Shana Muberes, on one hand, the Rabbeim were concerned in Shana Muberes. But on the other hand, because they were concerned inside the Helam Hadover, the Miyut, but on the other hand, we have a tikkun for it. And that's why the Eibishter made it this way. The tikkun is you add a month. You add a month of Adar. If it would have always been a discrepancy, it's one thing. But we have a solution. And the solution is that you add a month. And it's not just who adds the month. It's not Mumayl Lamata, it's Mamat Lamayl. That's part of what Chazal do. Just like we talk about Kiddush HaChedesh. Chazal do it. And they learn from the Psukim, from Chedesh Aviv and so on, that we add a month. And what month? A month of Adar. Now technically the reason it's Adar is because it's the last month of Chodshei Hashanah. Nisan is already Chedesh HaRishon. So when would you do the Muber? It's the last month. But that's just that's a technicality. The main reason is, as the Rebbe explains, why it's Adar, because Marbim B'Simcha. Because Adar itself is also the same theme. Adar would not have been a Chedesh of Simcha if there was no Gzeira. The Gzeira is Haman, which was designated in the month of Adar, because he thought it was a bad month for the Eden because of the P'tiris of Moshe Rabbeinu. And it ends up being the opposite. So Chedesh Asher Nepach Lehem, V'napachu, that it becomes like Yehuda Mesa Erev V'Simcha V'Sasm Yikar, so Yisn Er Min HaCheshach. So Adar captures this very theme. So what month is the best month to use when you want to make a tikkun for a Helam? A month that exactly the whole theme of the month is that. So they add a month of Adar. And so therefore Marbim B'Simcha is now not 30 days but 60 days. It's Kaflaim L'Tishiyah. And why? Because the Simcha that comes from a Helam is always deeper. So on one hand, as I said, there is the challenges of this year. But on the other hand, is the Magdim Refuah L'Makkah and the Tikkun, that's Mamala D'Chsodin. As the Rebbe writes, maybe tell the guy to go downstairs. Does he have that? So the bottom line is that the Rebbe writes in a letter. I mean, every year I almost believe whenever there was a Shana Muberes, one of the letters, Bechtav and Klolim for Rosh Hashanah, included that theme. And some letters were focused completely on that theme. So the Rebbe writes in a few places, which I don't know if anyone said it before the Rebbe, that you see that the Shana Muberes is, like I mentioned before, is not just you mamala the 11 and some hours, 11 and a half days, for example, of the missing deficit. You add much more than that, which is interesting, because if you're coming mamalach sudden, like a deficit, so you fill the deficit, and then you have it equal between sun and moon. But Chazal say, no, you don't split a month into halves. So therefore, you fill, but what's the lesson from that? That when you mamalach sudden, you always have to add a lot more than just filling. It's not just enough that from Yerida, you go back to Aliyah. It has to be Yerida to a higher Aliyah. Like the Gemara says about profit. A businessman is not someone who invests $10 and brings back $10. If you invest $10, you have to bring back $100 or whatever the number is. So especially when there's a Helam, it won't be justified if you just take care of the Helam. So you have to have an extra amount. So you have almost triple of what's missing. A month of 30 days is almost triple the 11-day deficit. In Aveda, this means that whenever there's a Helam, whenever there's a Chsodin, You have to not just do the Aveda equal to what you would have done when there was no chassan, but you have to do triple amount. So all this leads to, as I said, the Heiron Avedas Hashem, a month like this. And this is like the bottom line, the punchline that the Rebbe brings in all the sichos and the letters that he talks about the Shana Muberes. That yes, on one hand, it began from a Miyut Alavana, from a diminishment, which was the thing that caused us to have to, in the first place, create a Shana Muberes. But once we do, it shows the power that we have is not just b'mamal l'chsad, not just to fill dai machsede, but also at the chayav la'ashrei. In other words, it has to be more than just the what's sufficient, but actually Chassidus, to go far beyond b'chol meidecha, even more than regular. And that's taka what we see. You see the Maimon Abbas Lagani. What's the word there? That dafke mitzada helem of Muhammad. As Ma Muhammad, when is Nizgala the bizbuz eitzes, the splurging of the greatest treasures, the ones that are completely concealed, the highest levels of elikus, is dafke nehelam. And you see it also b'teva adam, when a person is in a state of distress, mina meitzar, karosika, anani b'merchav. That whenever there's a situation of challenge, the challenge, if you allow it if you do what you have to do, the challenge will always bring out deeper keiches. And those are the deeper keiches that Shana Muberes provides. So when you think of it this way, it's not just another nice word, it's almost like a yesod in Yiddishkeit. It's a yesod in Torah mitzvahs, and that's what the Rebbe did. Took a Shana Muberes, which, as I said before, is a halachic concept, and a technical one, and it's relevant to different Haklas Kiddush HaChedesh, and different to the laws of Purim and laws of Pesach and all the things that Shana Muberes affects. But the bottom line, the biggest point is that it has that element of teaching us what the holy Yisod of Aved is and all the concept of Helam B'Shvil HaGilui, Tzimtzum B'Shvil HaGilui. One final point, which is another very interesting point that Rebbe makes, and that is about Shemesh and Levana itself, Mashpim Makabel. So there's just to use a Baal Batisha example. In life, there are two types of people. There are people who are very consistent. You can rely on them, absolutely. A time is a time, a schedule is a schedule, a deadline is a deadline. And then there are people that are very, let's put it this way, not so reliable. However, they have a different mila. Their mila is they're spontaneous. They're exciting. And that's why they're not scheduled. They're usually not that organized. So let's say in Shidduchim, so people say, which is better? To have the reliable one, but it could be a little boring because everything's predictable, like a clerk. They're always there on time. Or to have the person that's more exciting, but you know what? You can't always rely on that person. I don't know, if you look at personalities, you'll see there's both types. People are always on time and actually early for appointments, and there are always people that are always late. I'm not justifying being late, but my point is, it's usually has osamayla, which means a person is not so locked in like a yekes, so to speak. Everything is so controlled and something so structured. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands which category you're in, but everybody knows who they're like. Sometimes you have in a marriage, actually a couple that are very different, and they usually get on each other's nerves when they have these two different personalities. So the Rebbe never spoke about it quite in the language I just said, but he spoke about it in a little more different language, which is that what's more negay in life, to have Yisodis Chazokis, strong foundations that are unwavering, or to have growth and movement. Because l'cheira, they don't always come together. This is where you see a lot of sikhs where the Rebbe speaks about nitzavim vayelach, when they come together. Nitzavim, nitzav melech, strong, standing in one place, unwavering, unshakable. Vayelach means halicha. The Rebbe speaks bahar b'chukesai, similar. Bahar is like a mountain, b'chukesai telechu, movement. And the answer is you need both. Look at a tree. A tree on one hand needs very firm roots that are deeply rooted in the ground that keep the tree strong. There's a tree trunk that does not shake and does not move. Precisely because you have that solid base, that's why it can then branch out, and you see a tree grows and it spreads, and the branches, and if it's leaves, and if it's a fruit tree, it grows fruit. If you only had the solid trunk and no growth, that's also not. So you need to have both. Like the Lashon Chazal is like halichas elam lei, al tikra halichas ala halachas. So on one hand, halacha seems very rigid. Halacha is leipachas v'liyesa. This is the halacha. You can't change. Leizazmim came. But halacha is also from the word halicha. Where you do a mitzvah, you have to always be b'chol yem yir beinecha chadashim. So you don't change the technical part of the mitzvah, but with kavana, with new passion, with new chayas, with new vitality, and so on. So what's relevant to our discussion? The shemesh and levana is two darkei derachim and avedus Hashem. The shemesh is consistent. You know exactly how. Even though the shemesh, the sun also has sun flares, and the sun also goes through small changes, but it's not that obvious. The moon is all about change. Every day is a different day. The cycle of the moon. So the Shana Muberes teaches us that we have to reconcile the two. And you have to make a connection, a chibur, a yichud between the two of them. That it's not just one or the other. That we have to have both the consistency of sun, of shemesh, and the shenuyim of levana. Just like a tree that has both sides. So on one hand, strong Chassidus and foundations, and while also having the spontaneity and the growth that comes from Ma'alim B'Kedesh and Shinuyim and changes. And both together, that's the yesod of all of Avedis Hashem. So that's somewhat of a summary. I hope I did justice to the Nekuda of Shana Muberes Api Hashkofis Teres Chassidus. And again, the Iron Avedis Hashem is both the concept of, the last thing I just said, the yichud of Mashpi Makabel, the yichud of Shinui and Tmidus, like Tmidin Kesidin and Mesofim Kol Chasam, while also the idea of Helam B'Shvil Agili, especially in our times, where we need those lessons in this Shana Muberes, of realizing that even when it's a Helam, it's really ultimately meant to be a springboard to far grace of Giluim, and we should already be Zeicha, Mismach Gula L'Geula, as we say about the second Chedesh Adar, Gula Amitis V'Ashlem. Okay, Kol Tuv and be well.